We are going to be reading chapter 15 today. It starts on page 115 of Darkwater Rising. Climbing down from the ridge seemed more difficult than going up. One blunder and we'd end up sliding across the broken slate and glass that stuck out everywhere. It was slow going, and before we were even halfway down, I heard another faint call. A man's voice this time. I stopped and listened. Josiah tugged at my arm. "We can't help him, Mr. Seth. We need saws, lots of them." I jerked free of his hand, angry at our mounting helplessness, then glared at him. "My name is not Mr. Seth. It's just plain old Seth." He stared at me, eyes weary, brimming with misery. "Not for me, it ain't," he said, and continued down the ridge. His words stuck in the air right around me, leaving me almost too weak to move, but I recognized the truth in them. The very people who went out of their way to make sure I made something of myself, like Papa, Uncle Nate, and even Mr. Farrell, were the same ones who kept Josiah right where he was. What I'd asked of him was impossible. I heard another weak call from deep in the debris, and it propelled me down. I searched the wreckage ahead for help, and not too far from us, I saw a half-dozen men loading bodies onto wagons. "We need help," I called, long before they could hear us well. An older man with a gray beard turned to watch while we struggled across the muddy ruins toward him. "People are trapped back there. We need saws." They continued to stare but never offered a word. "I said," yelling louder, "there are people back there trapped, still alive." I pointed behind me, breathing hard. I heard them calling for help. The bearded man nodded slowly. "We heard you, son." "We ain't got no saws," another man said, pulling a dirty rag from his back pocket. I felt an angry heat building inside me, and my glare bounced from one set of hollow eyes to another. "So we'll find some," I hissed. Pain swept across the bearded man's face. He hung his head, pulled in a breath, and when he looked up again, the grief I'd glimpsed only a moment ago had been veiled. "Don't worry, son," he said. "Go on home. We'll take care of those people." "No, sir," I shook my head hard. "I made a promise." The man with the dirty rag mopped sweat from his neck. "We already told you, boys," he said quietly. "We ain't got no saws." The rest of the men shifted uneasy-like, avoiding my eyes. "We're doing all we can, son," the bearded man said. I stared past them to the wagon, to the pile of bodies and the muddied arms and legs, already stiff under the hot sun, and just stood there till Josiah backed away, his head bobbing. "Thank you, sir," he said to them. "Mr. Seth here sure do appreciates all you's doing." They nodded, and Josiah pulled me away. "The man be right," he whispered. "We needs to get home." "I can't, Josiah. I promised her." "Yes, sir, I know that, but the girl, she already sees how things really is." I stood there while the hot sun beat down on us, breathing in the terrible odor of mud and death, and squinted up at him. "My mama told me right off 'fore she died last winter that angels whispers to her and showed her heaven's own gate. She knew she'd be crossin' over real soon." I peered toward the ridge, trying to make sense of what he was saying. It was true the girl hadn't asked for help. She'd asked only that we remember her name. The shard of mirror caught the sun, and I flinched from the glare. "So she knew?" I whispered. Josiah nodded, and the heavy truth of it slowed my heart till I thought I might die right there with her. Josiah waited, but I knew I couldn't go home. Not yet. "I can't leave her," I said. Sweat trickled down his forehead, and he wiped it away with the back of his sleeve. "I knows," he said, squinting against the sun. I headed back to the ridge, and without a word, Josiah followed. We began the slow climb, but this time I heard no voices, not one. I reached the broken mirror and knelt over the opening. "Sarah Louise!" I shouted. "We're back, like we promised." Josiah kneeled beside me, listening. "Sarah?" I called again. "Sarah Louise Ilson?" Wind whistled over the ridge. I glanced at Josiah, afraid to even breathe, and he hung his head. Leaning close over the opening, I called again and again. That's the end of chapter 15.